I do want to talk about this because 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 unfortunately what's been going on a lot. I think all of you have been on top of this, right? Of Israel Palestine and what is effectively a genocide and is now more openly being described as a genocide, not only by activists or pro-Palestinian supporters, but by institutions that have largely just sat down, like the United Nations, aren't really doing too much right now in terms of what they can do to help the Palestinian people. But there has been more and more evidence showing not only that Hamas didn't kill the majority of the people that Israel alleges they killed, but that it was Israel that actually shot at its own civilians under this so-called Hamilton Directive. Now, have been writing away on compiling so much information on all of this, and that should be out in a matter of days. But there have been various outlets, various Twitter videos, basically depicting the evidence that Israel, during the October 7th attacks, was not distinguishing by choice between Hamas militants and their own Israeli civilians. And one of the biggest things that we saw, one of the biggest events that we saw portrayed on mainstream media was, of course, the Supernova Music Festival that had been wrongly described as a peace festival, but it was actually a rave basically taking place right next to the border fence. And now we're seeing more people openly talk about this, more witnesses coming out and saying, oh, they were shooting at us. We had our hands up. We had to speak in Hebrew in order to not get shot. And we have seen from Israeli media and Israeli outlets depicting that these helicopter fighters from the Israeli Air Force basically had no choice but to just shoot at the Hamas militants, and they couldn't really distinguish who was a Hamas militant and who wasn't. And so we'll go through this for a minute, and I definitely want to ask your opinions on all of this. But this video that I posted, this video is old. This is a video that came out from an Israeli media site. And the Israeli site basically had this video on very early on, a few days after October 7th. And it basically depicted these helicopter pilots, this video from this Apache helicopter just shooting at civilians indiscriminately. And you guys can play the video, Jamie, if you can play the video. And so people can see what I'm talking about here. Yeah. So this recently picked up steam again, even though it's not anything new. And a lot of people have been talking about this showing because this article, and I'm pretty sure I outline it in the thread. I put it in a thread. Basically summarizes how these pilots were just incessantly shooting at these targets, and they didn't really stop to assess who they were until after, right? And this is what they said. The Apache pilots, and this is translated from the article that was in Hebrew, testify that they fired a huge amount of munitions, emptied the belly of the helicopter in minutes, flew to rearm, and returned to the air again and again, but it didn't help, and they understand it. And this is, of course, was reported on Niko, which was an Israeli outlet, and it was also reported on a different outlet as well. And the Apache helicopters appear to have focused on vehicles streaming back into Gaza from the Nova Electronic Music Festival, and nearby kibbutzes attacked cars with apparent knowledge that Israeli captives could be inside. And then they also fired unarmed people that were exiting cars or walking on foot. So another thing that in my research that I saw was that the Hamas fighters were on WhatsApp and they were on their mobile phones, and they had been told not to run or move very quickly, because the Israelis would then know that they were terrorists, right? And so that's what they were told. So they didn't do that. And so the people that were civilians were obviously scared and running for their lives. So they were the ones that were being shot out. So of course, all of this is what we're getting as a compilation of witness testimonies, of videos of all of this. But you can conclude that if they're shooting at what they think are terrorists moving around, they're gonna hit some civilians, especially with the way we saw also, apart from all of this, the damage of the houses, the damage of the cars could not have been done by Palestinian resistance. It could not have been done by Hamas. They don't have those weapons. You would need launchers to really destroy homes in the way they were destroyed. And so I just want to ask your opinion first, since I've been talking a long time, on all of that and what you guys make of that. Whoever wants to go first.
I do want to also add into what Fiorella and piggyback off that too, as well as we get your opinions, Ryan and Don. Shouldn't this change their whole narrative of the way this war, this conflict is going, since, a lot of, all Israel has said, and I have a video coming up next about the PR point of view. I think it's coming right from Frank Luntz's mouth about how to portray this, or how to approach the situation to condone what Israel's doing. Doesn't this change everything? If it was the IDF that killed a lot of its own citizens, where you see the Israeli media, the government going, what Hamas did on October 7th was wrong. What Hamas did, Hamas. Please, Ryan or Don, whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, I'd like to start with just a couple things, just so it's out of the gate, that I would argue that I don't think that we can prove that the majority that were killed were civilians. I would agree that that's something that seems likely based on what we're seeing, but I think it's important that we say that the information we've seen proves that some of the people that were killed were shot by IDF members, per the evidence, I think that's the important way to frame that. And I would make sure it's the Hannibal directive. And that's the important discussion point around the justification about murdering or killing their own people to avoid the fallout that might come because of those hostages being held. But I would agree. I mean, I think what you're saying there, to address your thing first, Pasta, is that obviously it does, knowing that there is an element of this that puts them being belligerent, being, indiscriminately firing. And I don't even feel like that's an appropriate term to use for many reasons, but obviously we've seen that continue into what's going on all over Gaza. So it's not really hard to wrap our minds around, but I would argue that, if the media cared at all about discernment and pulling in these other facts to their story, they would be caring about the fact that it's been occupation for 75 years and many other factors that, add to the complexity of this. But I don't think it's not about if this happened. As you guys were just discussing, we've got, I think, 4 or 5 different individual people, one of them being the security individual. I think it was on the security team at the kibbutz area, I believe, speaking on the record with Israeli media, saying that they shot and took out both hostages and civilians. We've got the people from the music festival themselves, both people that we can prove were killed, but also, as you said, people that were like, they were shooting at us and we had to go, whoa, we're not. And then they didn't get shot. I mean, there's the whole story is rife with these examples, or the new information we have about the cars. As you said, Fee, that we can prove many examples of munitions that they weren't capable, or rather explosions showing that they used munitions that they didn't have in that moment. But the cars that we saw, they recently put out as a kind of another example of look at all the horror they caused, proves that point. Or the burnt people in the cars that were fleeing, which is what that helicopter video is showing. That we can't say every one of those are all civilians, but even they admitted, as you said, that they could be, and they shot anyway. So it's just an amazing situation that I think the whole point of this is it needs to be this all out. This is where we can get into the concept of atrocity propaganda and how that's meant to be used. And I think that's what this really comes down to. Nobody should be dismissing the fact that civilians were hurt, Israeli civilians. I mean, I think we can prove this at this point, as well as children, not babies, because even their own data now shows that wasn't true, but that we can show. I think it was Palestinian Islamic Jihad just released a video with a 13-year-old boy. Right. That's a crime. I mean, nobody should be dismissing how bad, wrong that is, but it has to be taken into consideration what's really going on and the follow-up that's happened since. There's massive crimes being committed. And my final point in the opening point here is that means we should ask whether or not that means that this is something that was then either allowed to happen to justify certain actions, or something that they literally were involved with. And that's not my opinion. That's something being stated by Israeli civilians who are protesting outside of government buildings right now. It's really an alarming reality to see, but I think this is historically backed up.
Real quick, I just want to clarify.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify real quick, fam. It is a Hannibal directive. I think I said Hannibal. I meant Hannibal, but I want to clarify what that means for people who don't know. It's when it is a procedure from the IDF where the Israeli Defense Forces do everything they can, anything, to prevent the capture of Israeli soldiers to be used for any sort of prisoner exchange. So the idea here that has been accused at Israel is that they are doing this with civilians, not just with prisoners, but with civilians. And there have been various testimonies from people who worked at the one guy, as he mentioned, Ryan mentioned, who worked directly with the kibbutz, and also other journalists, Israeli journalists, have interviewed other members of the IDF who have said that this did happen, and obviously Israel does have a history of it happening. This Hannibal directive completely, it was completely taken off. It was completely not used since 2016. It was revoked, and supposedly now they have a different procedure that nobody really knows about. So if that is true, then that would be technically going against their own procedure if they were in fact doing this. But what is true that we can prove is that there is definitely a strong possibility that some of these civilians were killed by Israeli fire, and they were Israeli civilians. And I don't think at this point anyone's denying that Palestinian resistance did kill Israeli civilians. But I think that the portrayal that has been made up onto Palestinian resistance has led with Hamas as a red herring, has led with Hamas are terrorists, just like ISIS, and that they have shown absolutely no sympathy, etc. When in reality, a lot of the witnesses that were hostages coming out have said otherwise. And so what we're seeing here is the narrative sort of just being exposed, and the framing that has been overwhelmingly using the anti-Muslim, anti-Iraqi narrative that we've seen in the early 2000s again, and rehashing, the 40 dead beheaded baby story in the same vein that the incubator baby story was rehashed, has been directly flawed and false. So I just wanted to clarify that part. Go ahead.
Is the IDF still denying the fact that they've killed anybody? We obviously know, none of us are here denying that Hamas did what they did when they did it, right? I think people have to understand why there is a Hamas to begin with in the first time. But is the IDF still claiming that they didn't have any friendly fire, fam? Or is that something they've come forth and said, yes, there could possibly have been friendly fire? Does anybody know of this? Because I have not seen them fess up to saying that they could have killed some people in some friendly fire.
I haven't.
Well, you have to differentiate between the IDF members that have spoken to Israeli media and them saying literally what happened, because they're speaking to Israeli media, which is why we're not getting a lot of this information until after, it's being searched by several outlets. What is it, like Al Mayadeen, Al Jazeera, Mondel Weiss, Gray Zone, a bunch of people, a bunch of independent journalists have been looking at this information as well. We have all been looking at this and translating all of this stuff and basically seeing what was said, because we're not getting this. So the Israeli media might be hearing it. The Israeli military is saying it. But is the Israeli political sphere and the U.S. media talking about this? No, they haven't, which is why a lot of it is unknown to a lot of people, right? Because nobody knew about this. A lot of people are completely surprised that this is a thing.
Well, if they talked about it, fam, they can't yell Hamas, 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 Hamas anytime you talk about why you carpet bombing civilians. Right. Let's get Don in there. And Don, for the record, I think I saw somebody in the chat kind of compare me and Ryan, like, Pasta and Ryan are kind of on the same kind of trajectory. You being the leftist or the Marxist, kind of like Fiorella. I don't want to say that you won't wander into the the truther narrative, or the let's look at the bigger picture narrative. We were talking with Mark Sloboda, using the term globalist, what that means. I think we've had this merger of where the truther community and what's going on behind the scenes, the greater entities, what I'm saying, have kind of merged a little bit with the mainstream media and the independent media, because, Epstein really did have an island, and he did have a plane, and kids were really being used for currency. You know what I'm saying? But when it comes to this situation, I want to make sure that everybody understands, I don't think this was an inside job. I don't think it was a false flag narrative. I really think this was a resistance attack. I think there were more than just Hamas. Hamas did the heavy lifting, but there were other resistance groups involved and specifically because the Dahaya doctrine of mowing the lawn might have worked at first, but they're not having much success right now with this tunnel warfare. They're getting their asses kicked to them. And the IDF is having tanks disabled left and right. I think the only reason why they're going in is because they have to save face. And people are like, why aren't you going in there and getting Hamas? You said Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. You're just killing civilians. Go in there and get them. But as they're going in there, they're not prepared for this, and they're getting their ass kicked. Go jump in, Don, talk about whatever you want to talk about and everything we've been talking about right now, and give us your opinions.
I like to look at this like from an overview perspective and from a point of view of sort of a historical impetus. You have all these different things in motion. The starting with the Zionist movement in the late 19th century, to the call for European Jews, the Jewish diaspora, to come home, quote unquote, to Israel. At the time, they hadn't really decided whether it would be in the Middle East or Africa, but to come home to this particular place. A, Jews constitute a nation, and B, they need a homeland like any other nation. And so by the end of the First World War, Palestine became, as a result of it, became a colony, in essence, of the British, the UK. And a deal was struck with, Lord Rothschild and Balfour, the foreign minister of the UK, to at some point cede some of that land to this group of Zionists that he was dealing with, to make a Jewish homeland. At the end of the Second World War, after everything that was done in Europe by the Nazis and across the continent, basically killing millions of Jews in Europe, the U.S. and the UK, I guess this is one of the first neo-colonial projects coming straight out of the colonial period, decided to give chunks to allow, first of all, the creation of a state of Israel on the land of Palestine, and to allow the forcible removal of Palestinians from parts of Palestine and handing it over to this group of European Jews that were now going to be called Israelis, in the formation of the state of Israel. From that moment in 1948 up until this moment, the state of Israel has grown larger and larger in geographic area, as opposed to that which was allowed to belong to the Palestinians, who, by the way, have yet to be allowed to form a state of their own, having been destated, I guess, in 1948 with the Nakba. So you have in motion this accumulation of territory and this removal of Palestinians from the land as a dynamic since at least 1948 in a formal sense, with the approval of the United Nations. That's one thing you have going on. You also have Benjamin Netanyahu, who is facing a variety of criminal charges, who is standing like with one foot on a banana peel and the other in an oil slick with respect to his political standing as prime minister. He's one call away from being removed, and as soon as he's removed, he loses his immunity from criminal prosecution. And if you think Trump has it bad, these people actually have cases on these things. He's most likely going to spend the rest of his time in prison if he stays in Israel, unless he exiles himself to Miami or wherever else.
He's living in Miami.
Yeah. So those two things are going on. You have the condition of the Palestinian people and the normal human response to being exterminated, basically, that's brewing in the open prison camp that is Gaza Strip, and the other pretty much open prison camp, that's the West Bank, that have been under stress. Obviously in Gaza, also under boycott and sanction and quarantine and blockade. And we've seen even Americans can be shot, executed in international waters by the IDF with impunity if they dare to try to bring some sort of relief to the people who are being blockaded, and without things like crayons for kids, medicine, things that are essential to human life that have to go through the hands of the Israeli state, who claim that they're not occupying the place while they impose that condition on the people there. 2.5 million people living in an open air prison camp with no hope of relief. The world just watching and going, da, 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 da. The kids being shot in the street in a way that would embarrass Black Lives Matter in the United States. And yet there's no one that's going. So you get a frustration that comes out of that. You can call it Hamas, or you can call them revolutionaries. You can call them freedom fighters, whatever they are. This is a normal, healthy human response to that type of oppression. So you have that cooking in the stew pot also. Those three dynamics intersect with some incident that occurred on October 7th. A lot of people ended up dead, civilians. Those civilians, however, were on territory that had recently been stolen from Palestinians who were kicked off that land, some of them killed in the process, and the remainder driven into Gaza or elsewhere. And so, and not just occupying it militarily for the excuse that they had as a security zone, but having a huge party, a rave, within eyeshot of the retaining wall around the prison camp. It's not even it's not even taunting. Okay, it's a situation that almost induced what happened. This isn't to say that I'm not even going to go there. The mass of wrongs that have been done to the Palestinians, if you weigh them, they are maybe 2 or 3 orders of magnitude over those that have been done to people in Israel, the European and American Jews and others, Europeans who settled into that place since 1948. Palestine had nothing to do with the Nazi Party or Adolf Hitler. And if you were going to look around the world right now for who is responsible, I would start with the United States, who put a Nazi government in place in Ukraine that has been, among other things, shutting down churches and intimidating Jews. Because, by the way, Zelensky is not as advertised Jewish. His father was Jewish. His mother was not. And if his mother was not Jewish, then unless he converted, which there's no report of him having done, then he's not Jewish under Jewish law. So you have this situation where the U.S. is backing Nazis in one place. And this incident, by the way, comes, a week and a half after the embarrassment of Zelensky and the Canadian Parliament pinning medal on an actual SS Nazi for his service in World War II, which was killing Soviets, Jews, and others. This happens, and supposedly the anti-Semites are the only Semites involved in the conversation, the Palestinians. Well, you have European Jews on the one hand exterminating as the direct agents of something outside, most likely the ones supplying the weapons and the training and the targeting information and everything else. And of course, the Americans are the protectors of democracy against Nazism, even though they just dropped $200 billion into Ukraine that's run by Nazis, and they just canceled the presidential election. So this is the picture stuff. What happened in detail that day? Helicopters that from the IDF, so to speak, or the IOF, as people call it, the Israel Offensive Force, went in and shot up everything they could, and I'm sure they killed civilians, their own people, and others. And in terms of public relations, for example, and in terms of who benefits, there's really no restraint on the Israeli government, at least on Netanyahu, to be concerned about whether or not Israeli citizens are killed in this thing, because it only provides more impetus. You were talking about adjusting the narrative. The problem is which narrative. The narrative you want to adjust, and the one that we work on, is the one that's baseline to the extent that we can do it, to reality. there's other narratives. The narrative that prevails in Israel is of a people who were driven from Europe into the promised land given to them by God, and who are surrounded by hostile forces who are hostile to them and God. They're under siege. This is the average mindset of people, in the same way that Americans believe there's a hostile world trying to get us for our freedom. You have that narrative, and then the one that prevails in the U.S. and the Eastern EU, which is, this is the only democracy in the area. Some of our officials are actually speaking bluntly now and saying, and by the way, this is our protection against all those bad guys out there getting control of their own oil and charging us more than we want to pay. Those narratives are out there. The continuing narrative about what goes on in the Middle East starts at least in 1979 here with the Iranian Revolution, when people here were talking about those Arabs, quote unquote, even though the Iranians are not Arabs. That has been a constant drumbeat in Hollywood movies, in the media, and all across the world. That narrative still exists, and that's the framework for a lot of people in this country. So I don't know how you adjust that narrative without taking control of the media here, or finding a way to put this material that we do in front of mass audiences here.
Could I add one more thing, guys? I thought I'm really glad, Don, that you went. It's so difficult, as you all know here, to pull in every important aspect to this discussion. It's just near impossible, because every new point opens up to new points. But I'm really glad that you laid that out. And I just think that it's so important to think about, and even what you ended up kind of bringing it into, the idea that Netanyahu himself has a very clear, rational reason to create this. And that's why so many Israelis, both Jews and otherwise, are actively saying this stuff, that they were either involved or a part of. But what I wanted to add to it was the clarification about, whether the false flag kind of point to it, that it's not as simple as saying it was all part of this or it was all part of that. And this is what I've tried to piece through in regard to specifically the October 7th point. And this is why we bring in the fact that the Israelis are the ones on the record, many of them saying to Haaretz, to radio stations, that they were shot at, they saw people killed, is that it's a nuanced possibility. It's not new, especially from Mossad having the very motto of, through deception, that the Israeli government, or the U.S. government for that matter, would lie, fake, be a part of, even carry out or allow acts like this against their own people to carry out an event. But what I think is interesting is we know that Netanyahu was in a very politically unstable position. He's I think even more so now, but that it could have been something as simple as, and as Don adds, like the circumstances themselves justify the legal action. And I'll point on that before I end about the Geneva Conventions of what Hamas did in the first place. But it could be as simple as, say, allowing this to be an open corridor, or some of them, with the thought that maybe they would come in, take a few actions and leave, that got then taken advantage of, right? It doesn't have to be that his plan was to allow everything that happened. And maybe there were other people involved. But my point in saying is that we need to think about how it was obvious that there were allowances, like as Efrat Fangenson continues to point out, that there's just no possible way that this was it happened the way that they said it did. So it shouldn't be as black and white as all of it was some organized event or none of it was. I think there's a nuance to it. And what I was going to say in regard to one last thing about the Geneva Conventions, and I can't stress this enough, what happened on October 7th, whether Hamas was created by Israel and they're a false flag entity or not, or somewhere in between, is that they had a legal right to armed rebellion, because they're an illegal occupation. But then actions that were taken after that were illegal, even if we somehow feel they're justified because of the occupation, and you make a good point that Israel's the one bringing people into an illegal occupation, the point is still that they had a legal right to take violent action against their oppressor, the military, but the civilians, therefore, afterwards would still be considered a crime, no matter how justified we may feel so. I think that's so important to put in there, because that means that everything that's happening is based on a legal action. And nobody seems to want to say that. I think that's important.
Yeah.
Don, go ahead.
First, just on the question of, was it a false flag? Was it, leave a back door open or whatever? I don't think that's ever going to be known. And I don't think it's it's relevant in one sense, but not in the big picture, in my opinion. Certainly what happened immediately afterwards shows that there was forethought in terms of accomplishing what they're accomplishing now. Okay, they were ready with a plan to level Gaza. They've been working on it, for how long now? I mean, you want to go to 1967, you want to go to 2009, you want to go to 2014, whatever. Just like with 9/11, I don't know. 10 minutes later, they had like a 600 million page document. The whole Patriot Act, all of that stuff was all set. And but it was October 7th, I think they were in Afghanistan already. I mean, these things they wait for somebody to light a match. The question really isn't who lit the match. The plan is something that it's policy that they've made, that this is what we intend to do. And the moment we have a chance to do it, whether this person gets elected or that guy gets shot or it rains, on a Tuesday or this catches fire, we're in there. In Lahaina, they're ready.
Lahaina, yes. Same thing. Same fucking thing. Why do we care who started it? It's what comes after.
The same in the UK, July 7th, whatever, all of this. And so there's that. We could parse who did what, assemble all of the evidence together. And if there's a criminal trial ever, if you can find a court that'll try it fairly, it's germane there. The real thing is Israel intends to kick the rest of the Palestinians out, and they've kicked most of them out and taken most of the land already. That's the first thing. If there's going to be criminal liability or violations of international law or human law or conscience, you start there. And then what people do in response to that, maybe you can gauge that according to some body of law that no one really enforces, that there's not even a real international regime to enforce because you're paralyzed at the Security Council level. The ICC, you don't have the U.S. and Russia and a number of others. It's almost like the League of Nations, only worse. And there's really no place to take these claims. And finally, just looking at the U.S. behavior, you want to look at Europe's behavior going back to the 15th century, but look at the U.S. behavior in the post-war period. Since the United Nations was created, we've still managed to kill millions and millions of people. And you guys had Mark here right before I got here. I was with Stephen Sefton and Camilla Escalante like 5 minutes before. I was trying to stuff my lunch in my mouth when you guys picked me up. We were talking about the way that the U.S., after people liberated themselves, right now, 2 cases of Venezuela where they're fighting over, with Guyana over territory that's claimed by Venezuela since Bolivar, and the attempted coup going on now, like an attempted separate Congress in Honduras that's being, put together by the U.S. ambassador there. You can go down the list from 1953 to in Chile, in Guatemala, and 1973 in Chile, and Brazil with the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, and Argentina, and all of the. This is something that they're fighting 2 wars now, trying to start another one with China, and they still have time to play all these other games. And Israel is one front for that big chess game, and so I don't know what happened on October 7th, and I'm really not that curious.
Yeah. Wow.
I just, fam, real quick, before
That's
we
awesome, by the way.
talk about
Awesome.
Kennedy, because I think he's relevant in all of this. I do think we have to look at what Israel-Palestine from a macro and a micro sense, meaning in order for it to be the false flag, the full-on false flag that some people are claiming, there would have to be, you have to dismiss what the Palestinian resistance and the 17 different factions and the Al-Qassam brigades and the different factions within it have been doing for the last few decades. You would have to dismiss what they have been studying, all the time that they've had, all the reasons that they have had for these attacks that have been being pushed and worked on for a really long time. I think when you look at conflicts only from the macro and the big picture, and you start at the end, I think it's good to do that, to see who benefits, who doesn't benefit. But that must be accompanied by on the ground testimony. It must be accompanied by the inner dynamic of the political sphere of Palestine. The fact that Hamas, although it was created by the United States and Israel as a method of controlling and pushing out the socialist government, in recent times has become a more militant government form, not government, but more a sort of offshoot of the government that has pushed a lot of retaliation and resistance on behalf of Palestinians, and that many Palestinians see the Fatah government and the Palestinian Authority as complete and total betrayal. They see them as traitors because they haven't done much to really push the Palestinian cause, that they have only been pretty much playing the diplomatic BS line with Israel. So there are various opinions on what Hamas is, on what Hamas isn't. But what we have to take into consideration is a lot of things has changed since the creation of Hamas, since its inception, since what it actually is today, and a lot of things that have been happening right now on the ground really show Israel isn't what we thought it was. It does show that, there is this sort of fake wizard behind the curtain. What you saw, on V for Vendetta, for example, the image that has been portrayed of Israel with the Iron Dome and this force and all of that means nothing, or means very little, without U.S. support, without its handlers coming in from behind. And we also see this in Ukraine, the way Ukraine has gotten the best weapons, the most advanced artillery, the most advanced tanks, but that really means nothing when you don't know how to use them, when you don't know the territory, and when you don't know how to fight. And as we've seen numerous videos of these militants, the Palestinian resistance, crawling out of tunnels and quickly destroying these tanks, that part, I don't think the majority of people have been exposed to, understanding that level of what they have been able to do on the ground versus Israel that has been relying strictly on AI and surveillance for a very long time. So I really, the only reason I wanted to point that out was because I do think that sometimes people need to really go back to really looking at the on the ground happenings just as much as we look at the overall big picture. And in terms of who benefits from this, we know clearly the United States and Israel will always have a plan when it comes down to what they see Israel as. And this is where I want to go to Kennedy, because Israel literally was created as a vassal, as a military vassal for the United States. And Biden said it himself as well, as we all know. So that is true. That is definitely something that we can talk about.